It's 3 o'clock. I think we can get started a bit slowly, and then people will come dropping in as the time goes, I think, the first couple of minutes. But warm welcome all to this webinar on the linkages between women, peace and security agenda and the work to mitigate and adapt to climate and a biodiversity crisis. Very happy to have all of you here and also this brilliant panel. Warm welcome. My name is Charlotte Brut. I work at the Kvinna Foundation, and I will be moderating this session. And Kvinna has supported women's rights and queer rights organizations in conflict-affected countries for over 30 years. And we see that the climate crisis, security and gender are very much interlinked. We know that women's rights organizations are the first responders in many crises, be it conflict crisis or climate crisis. We also see that the women's rights organizations are the ones to see and catch the early warning signals in crisis or upcoming crisis. Yet we know that women's rights organizations and women in general are often left out in discussions on how to build and fund responses and prevention. We are here today to present our new policy brief, where we look into this nexus in a more substantial way, both to identify the challenges, but also the common solutions for the future. And after the presentation of the policy brief, we will have 3 different aspects or angles to this nexus. We will hear from Syria, how climate and water shortage, for example, and gender was definitely an issue during the conflict, but also how it affects or should perhaps affect reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria today. We will also have reflections and some insights from the COP30 negotiations on the gender action plan, but also the integration of women environmental human rights defenders for the first time, I believe, in this document. And we will also talk about the responsibility of global actors and the much needed social and economic transformation. But I will present the panel as we go along. We only have an hour, so we will get started. The question and answer chat is open, so please post any comments or questions that you might have in the chat, and we'll make sure to have some time by the end of the session to look at them. But let's get started. And Bridget, I will start with you. You are Bridget Reinhardt. You're a women's rights and gender equality expert. You're based in Kenya, and you're also a former Kvinna colleague and the author of the policy brief extending WPS agenda, women, peace, and climate security. So could you start off by walking us through the main points of the policy brief, and also maybe bring your own reflections on what stood out for you, and also bringing all your experience of working in this nexus for many years in the region. Yes, so please, Bridget, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm happy to be here today to present Kvinna's new policy brief, extending the Women, Peace and Security agenda, Women, Peace and Climate Security. I want to start by grounding us in the reality that shapes this brief. Across the world, armed conflict, environmental degradation, and climate change are converging with increasing frequency. They're interacting and accelerating each other. And within that convergence, women, LGBTQI+ people, and other marginalized groups are experiencing heightened inequality, violence, and exclusion. Women's rights organizations have long understood the linkages. They've shown that gender equality is central to sustainable peace and climate resilience. Feminist movements are increasingly bridging silos between conflict and climate response and prevention and linking women's rights and environmental activism. The Kvinna Foundation believes that it's imperative for the road ahead, where conflict, environment, and climate change merge, to learn from the works of women's rights organizations and the WPS agenda and community more broadly. We have together 25 years of experience building on inclusive peace and governance frameworks, and it's time to draw on those lessons. With this brief, Kvinna till Kvinna is digging into what it does best, which is drawing on this long history of working with women's organizations in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So this brief, therefore, uses the 4 pillars of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda to frame the ways in which environment and climate change manifest and interact. And then it moves into sharing ways in which WPS can better integrate and provide solutions to these converging crises under the same pillars. So before I dive into the pillars, for those who might not be familiar, environment and climate change was formally included in the WPS agenda through the 2015 Resolution 2242, which marked a starting point for formally linking climate security to WPS. However, progress in mainstreaming the climate WPS connection across national and international policies has been uneven, to say the least. So turning to the pillars, which are participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery, let me briefly outline the issues at stake that are covered in the brief. So when it comes to participation, the gap is well known. Women remain underrepresented and undervalued in peace processes, and that same dynamic is applied to climate governance. At COP29, for example, only 6 out of 78 government leaders, that's less than 8%, mentioned women in their climate statements, and 4 of those were women themselves. Women's rights organizations that Kvinna till Kvinna works with across Middle East and Africa have, and other regions, say the same thing. Climate policy language is technical and exclusionary. Gender is barely visible in nationally determined contributions. Funding modalities block grassroots organizations from participating. Political representation and underrepresentation in parliaments limit women's influence. And the result is easy. It's that climate solutions fail to reflect women's needs or insights. With prevention, women are often the earliest warning system signs for both conflict and climate shocks. So they're the first ones to see shifts in water, crops, food security, or resource tensions. Yet prevention strategies rarely connect climate adaptation to, for example, GBV risk reduction, sexual and reproductive health rights, social protection more broadly, and local peacebuilding efforts. Without integrating these into climate adaptation and mitigation efforts, climate shocks can quickly cascade into displacement, food insecurity, and increased violence. When it comes to protection, Kvinna till Kvinna partners have documented increases in domestic and public violence linked to environmental stress and climate change. Economic shocks drive harmful coping practices like child marriage, transactional sex, and unsafe migration practices. Protection risks for women environmental defenders are becoming very clear in the evidence base, and Camilla is going to talk about this as well. And in particular, how they're being threatened, sued, harassed, attacked, and digitally surveilled by state actors, corporations, and armed groups. Yet, WPS protection mechanisms rarely extend to environmental defenders, even though they face the exact kinds of threats that WPS was designed to address. Relief and recovery, when it comes to that, women rights organizations are always amongst the first responders after floods, droughts, heat waves, or ecosystem change. But current adaptation, mitigation, and development, humanitarian measures are failing to address the gendered needs and uphold basic rights of women on the front lines of conflict and climate. Women's organizations are funded selectively, if at all, to respond to crises, and are often excluded from official assessments and recovery design. In Eastern DRC, for example, our partners saw that Recovery after the 2023 floods failed to capture women's needs at all, because gender disaggregated data was missing. And meanwhile, at the same time, then climate finance is remaining misaligned. So only 1/3 of climate finance goes to adaptation. Loans dominate financing to the poorest countries, which increases their debt burdens, and cutting in first into social protection budgets that are needed for relief and recovery. So lastly, relief and recovery from conflict and environmental damage will continue as long as military spending remains high. Militaries are amongst the biggest global carbon emitters, but they don't have to report their emissions under the UNFCCC. So as long as militarization continues to rise, which we're seeing quite clearly, cycles of crisis will continue. Now that I have thoroughly depressed us all, perhaps, let me come in with the solutions and learnings of what WPS can offer climate action. With participation, WPS teaches us that inclusion must come with meaningful influence and power, not just token seats at the table. Countries with more women in public administration are more likely to adopt progressive environmental policies and ratify environmental treaties. Meaningful influence must also happen at all levels: local level, where lived experience guides solutions; at national levels through Women, Peace and Security national action plans, nationally determined contributions, and national adaptation plans. And then at global levels, of course, at the COP, Climate Finance Board's Peace and Security forums. But none of that will be possible without flexible long-term funding for women's organizations to engage. With prevention, we're seeing that WPS NAPs emerge as a powerful tool to address climate risks, but most reference to climate are still superficial. We need climate integrated into all 4 pillars with concrete actions, targets, and budgets. And we need coordination, this is so important, across the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans, NDCs, and National Adaptation Plans in countries, so that gender responsive climate action is aligned across sectors of governance. When it comes to protection, everything WPS developed on GBV prevention, risk mapping, safe reporting channels, survivor-centered services, all of these can and should be applied to climate-affected communities. Protection must also apply to women environmental defenders. That's relocation mechanisms, rapid response funds, legal aid, digital security support. The WPS agenda already recognizes civil society as key actors. We just need to expand its scope to cover environmental defenders more clearly. Lastly, relief and recovery is a major entry point for addressing the confluence of climate, conflict, and environment. WPS shows clearly that recovery is strongest when women's rights organizations lead. So for climate and environmental crisis, this means that we need to ensure that women's organizations are taking the lead. So I'll just conclude with the 5 core recommendations from the policy brief. So 1, we need to strengthen the WPS framework. So future WPS resolutions must fully integrate climate and environment across all pillars of the agenda. 2 is that we need to transform national policy architectures. So we need to mainstream climate into WPS national action plans well, and we need to harmonize those with national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions. 3, we need to resource women's rights organizations. That is rapid, flexible funding under both humanitarian and climate financing structures that enable women's organizations to respond flexibly as needed to crises. We need to fund long-term movement building as well that brings together feminist activists and environmental defenders in especially conflict-affected contexts. And we also need to provide capacity support to women's organizations in sustainable agriculture, water, and energy. The 4th recommendation is to ensure meaningful participation, and I probably don't need to tell anyone here this, but intentional inclusion and influence at all peace and climate-related decision-making tables. We also need to provide leadership development and policy training programs around environment and climate change specifically for women's rights organizations. And lastly, we need to fill the knowledge gap. We're starting to do that with a lot of the research that Kvinna and its partners have done over the past 3 to 4 years, and with this policy brief as well. But we really need to support more research that documents the climate conflict gender linkages and ensure that that research reaches the advocacy actors who need it the most. So with that, I will conclude and hand back over to Charlotte to hear from the rest of our panel. But thank you so much. And it was really an honor to work on this brief. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And we'll get back to you a little bit, I think, by the after we've heard the other speakers. But thank you so much. And I also just want to say, you said in the prep meeting, you said that quite a few women's rights organizations still see it are still hesitant to engage in these issues because there are so many other acute issues that they have to work on, but that we really don't have the luxury anymore to sideline ourselves. We need to all all start working on these issues because they affect us all. So thank you so much for this. And we'll talk more about the COP and environmental human rights defenders in just a bit that you mentioned also, Bridget. But I will start now with, or move over to you now, Haima Al-Yousfi. You are a feminist researcher and journalist and also general program manager at the Syrian Female Journalist Network, which is also a longtime partner of the Kvinna Foundation. And your organization has done quite a lot of work on environment as a feminist issue. So could you please talk a little bit about both how the climate crisis and maybe water shortage mainly was a factor along with gender during the conflict in Syria, but also you mentioned when we talked earlier how these issues also affect or should affect and influence and inform the reconstruction and rebuilding now of Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me and having me in this very important conversation. Just a small correction, I'm not a journalist, but I've been working with journalists for the past 6 years, and I had the experience in communication and advocacy. So thanks for the introduction and for what Bridget opened with. But whenever we talk about Syria, the dominant frame is always conflict, forced displacement, refugee return, or the political transition. But underneath all of these, another crisis has been unfolding, maybe quieter, but equally destructive. And it is the collapse of Syrian environment and climate resilience. And when we look closely, we see that this crisis is also deeply gendered because women and marginalized groups are the most affected by this crisis. The conflict damaged water networks in Syria and contaminated wells and soil. There have been targeted and systematic targeting of water facilities in Syria, in the north and in the south. And it also reduced access, for example, to irrigation. So, for example, I believe in the last few years, also 75% of the agriculture depended on rainfall only because of the conflict and all the obstacles and the resource shortage in the different geographical areas of Syria. At the same time, climate change intensified droughts and heat waves, and we've seen many wildfires affecting the Syrian coastal areas, for example, very largely this year. And This created zones of extreme insecurity, where women are the first to deal with the consequences. Women bear the daily labor of securing water and also energy for their households. So girls were pulled out of school, of course, because this created a huge economic crisis for the families and the communities living in these areas. And women moving, for example, long distances to secure water or bring water back home, they face increased risks and harassment and violence, especially in areas where the conflict is still present. So the infrastructure collapses because of war and conflict. Climate extremes worsen the scarcity of resources, and the unequal gender roles push women into the most marginalized and vulnerable situations and positions. Women in rural Syria have always been central to agricultural labor, constituting up to 60% of people working in this sector. And even if their work is invisible, but when crops failed because of drought or soil contamination or all of the other reasons that I mentioned, or of course because of military operations, women lose livelihoods without having any political voice in the economic discussions or the decision-making positions regarding their communities. Also, the environmental degradation when pushing women into this vulnerable situation and political vulnerability, women are more dependent on aid. And the ones who decide how aid is distributed are mostly big organizations led by men. And this would put women again in a position of exploitation and being more and more vulnerable. And also with the economic crisis on the family, many studies also documented how domestic violence and early marriages rises when this happens. So the environmental crisis and the conflict situation reinforced existing inequalities. Urban centers versus rural areas, people with political connections versus those without, and of course, men versus women. When talk as this shift, as we now shift from talking about the conflict into early recovery and reconstruction, environmental issues are framed as technical problems, if ever mentioned. When they are talking about early recovery, they're talking about rebuilding water stations, repairing electricity grids, and restoring farmland, for example. But technical solution alone reproduce the same patterns that created the crisis. So who decides what gets rebuilt, who benefits, and who is consulted, and who is left out? Syrian women, especially those heading households, working the land or managing family needs, are rarely included in recovery planning. Even they carry the heaviest consequences of economic and environmental collapse. Another challenge that is the reconstruction happening in a fragmented political landscape right now, even after the Assad regime fell, but political tension persists, and there are still different de facto authorities controlling different geographies in Syria. So we still see the autonomous administration in Syrian northeast, in what we call the Syrian Al Jazeera, and also with the new conflict after the massacres in the coastal areas, but also after the massacres in Sueda, southern of Syria. Also, the southern of Syria is controlled outside of the central government right now, or the transitional government right now. So even if there are any environmental planning, these policies or regulations are not adapted nationwide. All of this, again, endangers health, livelihoods, and long-term stability. And the environmental protection remains excluded from the agenda when talking about rebuilding. We've been seeing videos and photos going viral online about cutting trees in many areas for rebuilding, for example, cafes or centers. And when activists are raising these issues, they are also faced by the notions that, okay, but also we need to rebuild the country, and also we need houses, and also we need places, and we need to invest because these economic investments will bring money to Syria so we can build our state and our country again, without taking into account that this will worsen the economic, the environmental crisis and the climate degradation in Syria more, which will affect livelihood and the economic situation of families and communities. In this context, of course, integrating gender and environment into recovery is essential for any sustainable peace, because the climate crisis doesn't wait for agreements or negotiations. We already seeing that this is the driest winter since 1956. Rainfall decreases for 54% between October 24 and March 25. So environment and the climate will not wait for agreements and negotiations to settle. Polluted water spread right now. We're also having a lot of news about people being poisoned just because they are from the drinking water. Al Fija Spring in Damascus facing a huge drought right now, and people are sensing this affecting their lives. And when these systems are not built with taking the environmental dimension into consideration, the system will collapse again in few years.
Thank you, Haima. Could you just one more minute and then you could wrap up?
Yeah, I only wanted to also talk about initiatives because you talk about how SFJN did the feminist is environmental issue also with collaboration with Kvinna, but we've been also working on environmental journalism. So also it's very important to see how women journalists, but also Syrian journalists in general, when men and women, and the independent media in our with our partnership have exposed also a lot of these issues. There are many initiatives starting to spotlight on these problems, and many environmental issues today are still depoliticized, but focusing on raising awareness on this and also encouraging and linking how environmental degradation is also a violation of rights, how climate adaptation without women participation is ineffective. All of this is very important, and most of these initiatives have been launched by women. And as many studies shown, and they are usually, because they are usually first to be impacted by these deteriorations, women are the first one to respond, and they are the first to come up with innovative solutions within their communities, from starting to give voice to the communities they have, or to provide recommendations or solutions via social media or through their networks.
Thank you so much, Haima. I think this was really a good also segue into Camilla's next. Thank you, Camilla. Hi. Thank you so much, Haima. That was really interesting to hear both about how climate and gender was spelled out during the conflict, but also, and it's really extremely important now in rebuilding Syria to take these considerations take these issues into consideration. And also the role, of course, of both journalists, but also of women environmental human rights defenders. So I will move on to you, Camilla. You are still actually in Brazil, and you took part in the COP30 negotiations, where we managed to get the new gender action plan, which actually also includes writings on women environmental human rights defenders. So could you give us a little bit of your reflections from these past weeks of negotiations, but also say something perhaps on your work on environmental human rights defenders? And I should say also, Camilla Polera, you are program associate for the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, and you have extensive experience in international law, climate policy, and human rights work. So please, Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I'm still in Brazil, recovering from these weeks of negotiations that I must admit have been kind of challenging for everyone. And just as an overview, I would not, of course, repeat the state of play and the intersecting challenges that women has to face and have to face confronting the climate crisis. But of course, the climate crisis and a COP is really visible. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, but in a world that really is already structured by power, privilege, and exclusion. And this enters in the broader outcome of COP 30 specifically, but this overlapping structures of oppression increase vulnerability for some and concentrate powers and privilege for others. And fossil fuels, that is unfortunately a term that hasn't been covered at COP 30 at all, are the purest expression of disorder. And across these inequalities, women in all their diversity continue to lead the demand for a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Indigenous women, and we have seen the strength and the power of their voices and their presence, even if they were not allowed to enter into the blue zone, the venue. They draw on ancestral knowledge to protect the environment, the biodiversity, and sustain the ecosystems. Women defenders, women environmental human rights defenders organize within the venue, but most importantly outside the venue, the resistance and sustain their communities. So women leadership is within the COP process is not symbolic; it's very essential to climate justice. But it's important to remember that when that considering the climate crisis is rooted in inequalities, the solutions, negotiations, but national policies must be interconnected to avoid that climate policies reproduce the very injustices that they claim to solve. The Human Rights Council Resolution 38.4 affirms that integrating a gender-responsive approach into climate policies enhance effectiveness, in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation efforts. The IPCC highlighted that actions prioritizing gender rights-based approaches, social justice, inclusivity lead to more sustainable outcomes. Yet, in the UNFCCC, so in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the primarily intergovernmental forum for addressing the global response to climate change, gender is treated as an afterthought. Or a problem instead of a framework for justice. We saw that really clearly at COP29 when the Enhanced Lima Work Program didn't recognize human rights language at all. And we've seen it also this COP where gender language gets added at the very end rather than shaping the overall agenda from the start. And most importantly, we have seen it at COP30 when in the gender negotiations rooms, all the discussion based on aiming at developing a framework and developing concrete actions and deliverables that could really change women's life get disrupted by footnotes discussions that for those of you who didn't follow the negotiations closely were a basic discussion on the meaning of every word and for different countries, for different groups. And the overall discussion barely reduced all the gender equality negotiation and discussion into negotiable footnotes. And at COP30, civil society, with the women and gender constituency at the forefront, asked the urge parties to deliver a gender-responsive climate action that was intersectional, adequately resourced, implementable at national level, reflecting the lived experiences of women, girls, and gender-diverse people on the front line of the climate action. And most importantly, at least from my work, the Gender Action Plan and this new Gender Action Plan presented the unique opportunity to include the commitments to eliminate, prevent, and respond to discrimination and violence against the women, environmental, human rights defenders, ensuring a comprehensive protection and support for women advocating for environmental and land rights. And specifically on defenders faced with an escalating climate crisis and the inaction of government, a growing number of people of women are stepping up to defend their rights, their right to future generations, and their right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, exercising merely their fundamental freedoms of expression, of peaceful assembly, association that is guaranteed by international human rights law. Right before going to COP, the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, Mary Lowell, released a report highlighting the deep-rooted and intertwined impunity and violence against environmental human rights defenders in Brazil. Specifically on indigenous defenders, Afro-descendant communities, women, and defenders from LGBTQI+ communities. But this is not just about Brazil, because from Latin America to Europe and beyond, those defending environment are facing with intimidation, surveillance, being labeled even as terrorist, arbitrary detention, violence, and death for insisting, for demanding that governments live up to their human rights and climate change obligations. Reports show that around 3 environmental defenders were killed or disappeared each week in 2024. And this means that every week a person that stood up for the environment paid the ultimate price for the action. And of course, this data, and we've seen, we hear how difficult the data representations are, capture only a fraction of the real scale of violence because across regions, limited monitoring, restrictions on civic space, fear of reprisals mean that there might be more attacks that go unreported. And of course, just like for climate change in general, the barriers faced by defenders are not equal. Women defending the environment suffer gender-based violence that rarely appear in the data, including sexual violence, harassment, and rejection within their family and communities. They're targeted not only as environmental defenders, and not only as environmental human rights defenders, but also as women. And this framework makes their work, the situation makes their work particularly dangerous and particularly invisible, to the point that UNFCCC still hadn't recognized in their decision their vital role. And this is true for women environmental human rights defenders, but this is true for environmental human rights defenders in general that were completely absent in the UNFCCC. Women at the forefront of climate action are carrying out some of the most essential work without protection or recognition. And accountability when harms occur has never been addressed before. So the rights of women defenders to participate in decisions that affect their lives, to have their contribution recognized, and to carry out their work safely has long been neglected in this process. And I would love to go through also the details of why this protection of environmental human rights defenders is not just a matter of political discretion, but it's a legal duty grounded in international law. I don't know if we have enough time, but just to sum up and give a few details that we may have the time to delve into
1 or 2
later.
minutes is fine. Yeah.
But that's perfect. But the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders for over 25 years affirmed that everyone has the right to protect and strive for the protection of human rights and to participate in peaceful activities against any violations. But and there are regional frameworks that strengthen this protection. And the Escazú Agreement, the Aarhus Convention are all frameworks that human rights framework that support the work of environmental defenders, of human rights defenders. But if I may just very, very rapidly mention the recent advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on the climate emergency and human rights that reaffirmed this commitment and clarifying that states have specific duties to guarantee defenders' safety, participation, and freedom from persecution, recognizing environmental human rights defenders as allies of democracy. Whose work takes on even greater importance amidst the urgency and complexity of the climate emergency. But crucially, the court recognized that women environmental human rights defenders face this double risk faced by women environmental defenders for their dual condition as women as and defenders, requiring even higher duty of care. And so this is the framework where we had to confront with, and for the first time, as mentioned in the introduction, COP30 and the Gender Action Plan finally recognized under a specific activity of the Gender Action Plan, women environmental defenders. And I quote, so it's under activity included for the participation, and it's enhanced safety protection mechanisms and support for women, taking into account multidimensional factors, especially for women environmental defenders and women engaging in climate action, to enable them to exercise their full, meaningful, and equal participation and leadership, and to promote knowledge sharing on climate policies and action. This activity then is related to different deliverables, to different outputs. There is a specific workshop to understand the challenges and the barriers to women's full, meaningful, and equal participation and leadership, and guidelines to support, protect, and safe the participation of women in meetings and events at all levels. Of course,
sorry,
yeah.
Camilla. I will have to ask you to wrap up. But
wrap up, yes,
please.
Just the final line, and then just the final line. Just to say that, of course, the challenges to adopt this language were many, and this is also a formulation that needs to be worked on because the Gender Action Plan inform parties as a tool for implementing climate action. So now it's the fight is not over, and we will continue to move forward in this direction. I'll close it here.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And thank you also for giving us heads up that the work is not over. But I think we can definitely say that this would not have happened if we wouldn't have had the strong women's rights movement at the COP, and beforehand also working on different negotiating delegations on country level. So this would not have happened without the women's rights movement, clearly. Thank you so much, Camilla. I will move on to you, Claire. Claire Duncanson, you're a professor of global politics at the University of Edinburgh, and also co-founder of the Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and Planet program. And you've been working on these issues for very many years in your research, and also sharing it very generously with civil society. And I would like to ask you to talk a little bit more about the social, political, and not least economic transformation that is needed, which is something that I think, sometimes hesitate to talk about because it's quite a complex issue and not always very welcome to bring up these issues in the discussion. But please do it also from the point of view of the global and regional institutions. Camilla talked about different global agreements and humanitarian law that we all should follow. So we do know that even though it doesn't always work 100%, to say the least, we still have these frameworks, and they have a responsibility also in this. So please, Claire.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, I wanted to say a few things about the big picture, the structural changes required in our global economic system that will could act to complement and reinforce the recommendations that we've heard from Bridget in her brilliant briefing, bringing together WPS and environment, but also would support the work of Haima with women in Syria, and what Camilla's been saying about women environmental human rights defenders. So why is it so important to talk about the big economic picture? I suppose three main reasons. When we think about climate change and biodiversity collapse, we know that it's the rich countries through historical industrialization that have contributed between 2/3 and 3/4 of historic greenhouse gas emissions. And that at the same time, despite having contributed hardly any, it's communities across the global south that make up the vast majority of the 3.6 billion people who are deemed extremely vulnerable. And I think all three speakers have made that abundantly clear today. And despite all the calls for climate justice at many COPs, climate reparations or climate finance, we still aren't seeing climate finance at anything like the required level. And worse than that, the rich countries continue to resist calls to transition away from fossil fuels. Secondly, wars exacerbate climate change and vice versa, as Bridget already outlined, so both interact to drive these devastating insecurities across the global south, while it's the bulk of the arms manufacturers and sellers, the real pushers of militarism that exist in the global north, and really have such a vested financial interest in perpetuating a very violent world. We saw last year, 2024, global military spending reaching nearly $3 trillion. That's 9% higher than the year before, similar to the GDP of all African nations put together. So there's clearly a kind of structural economic picture there. And then I suppose thirdly, just other features of our global economic system, such as debt, unfair trade regimes, illicit financial flows, mean that we see pretty much a constant flow of resources going from low-income and war-affected countries to rich countries in the global north. For example, because of debt, for every dollar that goes to the global south in aid, $4 comes back to rich countries. So it's pretty clear that we need these big structural changes in the economic system to reinforce programmatic work that tries to achieve women's security in the face of both war, climate change and biodiversity collapse. So I sometimes think it's useful when we think about these big structural changes to think about them in three categories, three different types. And the first one is ways in which we could try and stop the bleeding. So starting with that point I just made around transfer of resources from global south to global north, we could stop that. So one urgent task, it seems to me, is reinvigorating campaigns to cancel debt, to make trade fairer, to tackle illicit financial flows. And there's maybe an opportunity there in cancelling debt. It's something that nearly all the world's major faiths have something to say about the immorality of debt, especially odious debt that traps people in poverty. And so there's an opportunity there to build bigger coalitions, I think, to do something about that injustice. The second type is transfer of resources. In some ways, the advantage of that first category of stopping the bleeding, stopping the hemorrhaging of resources out of low-income and war-affected countries is it gets us a long part of the way to keeping resources within war-affected countries. But that said, there will still be a need for a greater transfer of resources as well. So we're still going to need much more generous aid from those countries that built their wealth on the extraction of resources and the industrialization using fossil fuels. You're still going to need lots of aid and climate reparations for colonialism. And that aid or transfer of resources needs to be in the form of grants more than loans, because as Bridget already mentioned, to the extent that help to war-affected or low-income countries comes as loans, it just reinforces the debt crisis. So we're looking for generous transfer of resources by means of grants and reparations. And both those first two things together can work to ensure that low-income states and war-affected states and civil society can have the resources to do the things they need to do to secure women's rights, but also protect and regenerate the environment. And then I think the third category is the longer term structural changes we need to see, both globally and locally, in support of an alternative economic model. So away from the linear thinking of orthodox economic models, which are very extractive, both of people's labour and of natural resources, very polluting, inherently inequality and insecurity driving. We need a transition away from them to thinking about well-being economies that are in the service of people being able to survive, and not just survive but thrive, and also to the restoration of ecosystems. So I think that can be quite useful, perhaps, thinking of these three categories of changes that we need to see in the global economic system. But I suppose as much as they are useful, they also perhaps serve to emphasize the scale of the challenge. You know, where on earth do we begin? How do we do all of that? And of course, there are no easy answers, but some thoughts. It seems to me that we really need to broaden the coalition of people calling for change, and others have already mentioned that today, but the need to build alliances within all countries between different organisations. So civil society organisations that might be focused more on women's rights or might be focused on the environment or peace need to be working together. Also, crucially, I think, with trade unions. And so that needs some work to show that our demands are not in conflict with each other. So making the argument that tackling climate change and ecological harm could be a great job creator and could be a great vehicle to tackling gender inequalities if it was sufficiently resourced with public money. So Haima kind of described this already with the potential conflict between those wanting to say, we just need to rebuild Syria, and once we've got economic growth achieved through whichever means, then we might be able to look after the environment. And as she made so clear, we don't have time for that. We need economic models that allow people to rebuild the environment, provide for themselves and their families through good labour, and build peace at the same time. So broadening coalitions, I think, is really, really important. And that will help us in each of us in all of our countries push for the transformation and economic thinking that we need. I think we can also think in terms of non-reformist reforms. So the revolution in our economic systems is not going to come overnight or easily, but how can we break down the ask? So just some better mechanisms for some debt cancellation is a step in the right direction. Are there some improvements we can have in our global trade system that just levels the playing field a bit, stops this wealth draining from low-income and war-affected countries north? So all those baby steps that add up to the transformation we need to see, I think, are really important. And then finally, I think there are lots of people positioned within international financial institutions, within the UN, within donor governments, who want to do the right thing by gender. There's goodwill towards the Women, Peace, Security agenda. There's goodwill towards all sorts of initiatives, but often I think we stop at participation. We say, yep, let's have more programs for women's leadership, women's representation in these structures, but can we push further? Can we remind power holders in these institutions that that's your kind of basic level of feminist change? It's necessary, but not sufficient. And at any time where there is this opportunity for women's representation, we say, yeah, this is just the very starting point. What can we be doing to, for example, cancel debt, change the trade regime, change the conditionalities that are imposed on low-income and war-affected countries when they are in receipt of loans. Just pushing further all the time to bring the bigger economic picture into all the spaces where we've managed to get a toehold. And that's me.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you for giving some energy into this. I really felt when you highlighted the three different steps that we need to work on. They are huge, but they became very clear. And I really like the broadening of coalitions. I really believe this is also something that we really need to work more on. We're very close to the end of this session. 1 hour goes so quickly. I wanted to go a quick round just to hear your reflections now that you have also listened to each other. Could you give me like one thing? This is for the next year. This is what we really, not just, yourself, but this is something I really would like to see happen during the next year. It can be small or big. And also, really quickly, we have a question to Bridget. Given the increasing pressure of climate change on community resources, how can WPS actors better integrate legal aid and protection mechanisms into peace-building initiatives to prevent domestic violence and strengthen women's resilience? That's a huge question. Maybe we have to leave that, but if you can touch upon that, maybe also, Bridget, in like 30 seconds. I will go the same round, and you have to, I'm sorry, but it's really very short. But on the other hand, the discussions so far have been so rich, so maybe that's okay. Bridget, 30 seconds are yours.
Oh God. That question really threw me. It's a huge question. I'm so sorry. We could actually spend the whole panel to the person that asked that, talking about that question. It's really important. But I guess related to that question, I would just like to see every single actor, whether you're engaged in humanitarian, environment, climate change, women, peace, and security to consider the impact of gender-based violence and in your work and the intersection with climate change, because this is not a siloed issue, and we really need to take it seriously. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Haima, what would you like to see?
It's a very huge question, actually, but I think I want the international community, but also the Syrian actors, to understand that Syria's future will depend on how we repair not only institutions, but also our relationship with land, water, and air, like the environment that sustain our communities. And that feminist movements and women-led initiatives can help reimagine this connection and making sure that justice, care, and sustainability are at the heart of peace building and sustaining peace. And provide more flexible and long-term support to women-led initiatives and to independent journalists who are working into making these very big issues visible.
Thank you so much, Haima. Camilla.
I think it's connected to a reflection, the fact that environmental defenders were not there in the UNFCCC, and they finally appear only through the efforts and fight of women. I think this needs to be very clear, and I would love to see women defending the environment, women defending their lands and their rights very central in all the different fora, not just the UNFCCC, but everywhere.
Thank you. And Claire.
One thing I think is, never think that you're not an expert in economics. I mean, every single person here that has been saying something about the environment is knowledgeable about economics. They're not separable. And so don't exclude yourself from that conversation. Another concrete thing would be, identify in your country, there will be an umbrella organization that's probably trying to bring together trade unions, environmentalists, equality activists. Find them and work with them. Let's build that coalition.
Thank you. And thank you all so much. I think this has been really a delight to talk to you. I'm actually feeling quite positive and reinforced and energetic. So thank you so much for giving that, even though the topic might not be always that, very positive. But you have really managed to make it concrete and giving it energy. So thank you so much, and thank you all of you who have listened in. And let's move this forward. Thank you, and have a lovely day and a lovely night.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.